Alex, what a delight to chat with you a little bit about your book. So thanks for being here.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
So let me tell you what I thought about what your book is for, and you correct me as a starting point. So my sense is that you think about the scientific method as a way to debug bad human thinking. And it's not a book for scientists, it's a book for everyday all of us, in which you basically say, look, science has been working for a long time about how to make sure we don't make some of the mistakes that are very tempting for us. So let me give you the case for science, where things work, where things fail, as a way to debug each and every one of our thinking methods, so that we can observe mistakes that we make in everyday life. Now, is that a fair way to think about this book?
Yeah, that's very fair. And so what was the point of laying this out? I think for a couple of reasons. Number one is that the basic scientific method is pretty simple, but people don't know what the steps involve. So I wanted to lay out the steps of the
It's
scientific
it's I think
method.
I think it's more it's okay to say it's simple, but it's unintuitive.
Yes, that's right. And so I wanted to lay it out intuitively because people think about this and it sort of sounds a lot of jargon, but when you lay it out clearly, it can be simple. And so it can be something for the average reader, the person on the street who is not a scientist, to be able to understand themselves. And also, the second issue is that even if people understand it, they might not put it into practice when they evaluate research because of their biases. So, just like your books look at how our biases cause us to make incorrect decisions, I'm sort of analogous to that, but rather than thinking about decisions and choices, I'm thinking about how we interpret information and how that can be distorted by our biases.
Yeah. So let's start with, like, what is the most basic mistake people make when they use their own intuition instead of the scientific method?
So it's confirmation bias. So what that means is that they have a view of the world, and if there's evidence that confirms that viewpoint, they'll lap it up uncritically, even if there are mistakes in it, even if it's one example which is not general and representative, even if it's a correlation without causation.
Yeah.
And on the flip
So
side,
let's
it
let's let's
means
take an example, as we said this. So what's an example? So I work in a company, and I
yeah.
think that what?
So let's say you believe that if you start with why, you'll become extremely successful. So why do many people like to believe that that's true? Well, we would love to believe that you could do anything you put your mind to. That's what you teach your children. And so if there is a book such as the one by Simon Sinek, which claims Apple is successful because it started with why, we think, well, that's evidence that starting with why leads to success. That's why his TED Talk is the third most viewed TED Talk of all time, and he's sold millions and millions of books. But that is one hand-picked example. So the scientific method would say, if your hypothesis is that starting with why leads to success, you'd need a representative sample of many companies that started with why, how many succeeded, how many failed, then a control sample of companies that did not start with why, how many succeeded, how many failed, and you want to compare the two. But importantly, your sample needs to contain companies that started with why and failed, and companies that didn't start with why yet still succeeded. But a book like Simon Sinek's would never contain those counterexamples because he only handpicks the ones that support his viewpoint, which is the companies that start with why and succeeded.
And you don't think that he's doing it in a kind of not an honest way. You're basically saying this is kind of human tendency. The human tendency is for confirmation bias. We have a theory. We look for only supporting evidence for that. Everyone that we say we celebrate, and then we look for more examples like that. And in a sense, we become our own worst enemies, because what is blocking us from learning the truth is this confirmation bias, which is very understandable but very counterproductive, and you might come to very wrong conclusions just because of this process. But this is a so you lay out kind of the importance of not getting sucked into confirmation bias. And you can say, in this case, you should think about people who started with this but did not succeed and did not start with this and so on. That's, of course, a very complex data exercise. So what do you recommend that we do in general? Because it's not as if every time we are facing a problem, we would go back and say, let me get all the evidence and all the companies that started this way and not this way. What are some other mechanisms to make sure we don't get sucked into this confirmation bias?
Well, I think it would be to, if you see something which confirms what you would like to be true, to just imagine the opposite. So imagine you found the opposite result. What would you think about it? So let's say you saw a company which started with Y and failed. You would say, well, that's just one example. I still believe that starting with Y leads to success. That could be just an exception. And so now that you've highlighted the fact that this is just one particular example, ask yourself, is this still a problem, even though the result is in the direction that you want? And so why I think this is so useful is that the tools to defeat misinformation are often within us. So I'm not asking the reader to do a PhD in statistics. I don't even need one myself. But the tools of discernment are just simple common sense. So whenever I see somebody post a study on LinkedIn that people don't like the sound of, there's no shortage of comments as to why correlation is not causation, the time period is too short, the sample size is too small. So people know what makes for a rigorous study. All I'm asking is to apply the same discernment to a study you like as one that you don't. And the idea of imagining the opposite is a way of overcoming the bias and making sure that you're as discerning to something you like as to something you don't.
Yeah, and it's a very nice kind of parallel here to misinformation that you're making, where you basically say that, let's say you're either pro-Trump or anti-Trump, let's say, and you hear something that is either very pro-Trump or very anti-Trump. If you hear the thing that fits your agenda, you would say, I knew it all along, and let me post it on social media. When you see something that you is not within you, all of a sudden you become an expert researcher. You talk about the incentives of the people who wrote this and the conflicts of interest and the methodology and so on. And what you're doing very nicely is you say, let's just make sure that we use the same burden of evidence on both sides. Let's make sure that we, and a nice trick about this is to say, what if it was the other way? What if it was the other way around? What would we do? What do we do then? So we have confirmation bias as one of the things that we need to deal with in a very, very strong way. It's about misinformation, it's about beliefs, it's about our ideas about how to raise our kids, it's about the kind of things that we do at work. What other things are there that the scientific method helps us with that we don't use naturally in our daily lives?
So there's another bias, which is known as black and white thinking. So what is that bias? So if you think about confirmation bias, that is the idea that we have a pre-existing view of the world, and so we go with evidence that supports it. But you might think there's many topics about which we don't have a pre-existing view. But black and white thinking means that as long as evidence suggests something is always good or always bad, we're more likely to latch onto it because we see the world in binary terms. So let's take diet. For example, protein most people think is good because we learn it builds muscles. Fat just sounds bad. It's called fat because it makes you fat. But carbs, that's not so clear cut. And so the Atkins diet exploited black and white thinking by suggesting that we eat as few carbs as possible. And so that was something which was really attractive because it was easy to implement. Just look at the carbohydrate label. You don't even need to count the number of daily carbs that you're having, and that falls within a 30 to 50% range, just minimize carbs. But similarly, had he had the other approach, which is to say eat as many carbs as possible, he might have gone equally viral because that plays into black and white thinking and it's simple. So then you would think, well, what does this have to do with the scientific method? So how can the scientific method help you? Well, number one, there wasn't actually much evidence on the diet that he was proposing, and often the scientific method makes sure that something is documented rigorously, and most things in the real world are not always increasing, always decreasing. Certain things have diminishing returns, even things such as water, which is good for you. You can drink too much water in a marathon and suffer from water intoxication. A second, more subtle point is
But
the
wait,
importance of.
let me
Sorry.
finish on that. So what is the inoculation against this black and white thinking?
So it's to go back to look for evidence. So to try to see, well, what is the evidence behind a particular claim? So with the Atkins diet, what they showed was that people who followed this no carb diet lost weight. But again, what would the scientific method suggest? It would suggest you'd need to look at some people who followed this diet and then a control sample. And that control sample, that could be people who followed no diet at all. But it's not clear that that would be a good control group, because you might think that the people who choose to follow a diet are doing other things to improve their life, such as exercising and sleeping well. So you'd need to have a pretty precise control group, which is that people are doing other good things, but they've just been randomly assigned to follow a no carb diet, where another group is following another type of diet.
Yeah, and of course with diets, the research is very tough because people don't follow a diet 100%.
Yes,
Even
yes.
the boundaries for diets are not very clear. When you say no carbs, you can't do zero carbs. People do a little bit, and it's very tough and very confusing. I have to say about myself, I've tried a few different regimes about eating and less exercising, more on the eating side. It's very tough to understand the relationship between cause and effect. The literature is confusing. The feeling on the self is confusing. Whatever you start take weeks to figure out if something might be working in the right direction or not. But in this regard, you're saying let's be cautious about anything that is 100% or zero. Let's understand that this is like a cognitive trap, that it's easy to do, but not necessarily with the right, like the mechanism behind it. Why would the mechanism behind it be 0 and 100? Very unlikely that Mother Nature would do anything that is 0 and 100 on things that we do regularly. And then you basically become slightly skeptical. And then once you become slightly skeptical, you can ask yourself, like, under what conditions would this be in the right directions, and how would I want to integrate it into my life?
That's absolutely right. So what I'm just encouraging the reader to do more generally is to be skeptical about evidence, because as you say, it's really difficult to prove things conclusively. But how often do we see in the media, new research proves that X? And so there's very strong definitive statements. And I think the stronger you make your statement, the more viral you're likely to be, because they think, well, this is the person who's got the keys to success in life. And the simpler and the more prescriptive the suggestion, the easier it is to catch on and the more likely it is for people to follow. But given it's so difficult to actually show cause and effect when diet is intertwined with so many other things, then actually what I'm suggesting is that whenever you see something which is very prescriptive, the evidence behind it is much likely to be weaker than the strength of the claim. And again, the scientific method helps us with this.
Yeah, but then what? So let's say you read a statement. You're saying, okay, now I understand that things are a little more questionable, and let me question them. And actually, I think many of the examples in the book make it a bit more clear about how to look at the world and look at the places where things are maybe too extreme, or how to be careful and how exactly to look at this. But what is the recommendation outside of trusting it less? What should we do? You don't want us to ignore completely that information either. So what should
No,
we
so
do?
So what I'd want to do is try to make sure that my information is from the best types of sources. So often we over extrapolate from one particular study, and that might be a study with a very strong conclusion. And we might then take that in conclusion and then use this to decide what to eat or how to exercise. But instead, what I'm trying to highlight is the importance of scientific consensus. And indeed, what does the scientific community, which includes professors like you and me and our colleagues, this builds on a body of researchers. And this avoids the problem of latching onto one particular paper. So how can you find scientific consensus? So in medicine, you have review articles like the Cochrane Reviews. In my field, which is finance, you have the Annual Review of Financial Economics. What is that? That is the leading scholars on a particular area are asked to write an overview of the scientific literature. And you also don't need to be as formal as that. For example, the National Health Service website will tell you what are the common side effects of a particular drug, what is the drug effective at treating, and that is based on a body of scientific literature rather than one particular study.
Yeah. So try to basically use lots of research rather than one. And when anything specific comes in, there's noise, there's mistaken interpretation, there's all kinds of mechanisms. It's the most new, it's the most recent, but it's not necessarily the most truth. But I was interrupting you. You were going to talk about the third bias.
Oh no, those are the only two, the two ones. But I think so. I was talking. I was about to talk about the second way in which the scientific method might address black and white thinking, which is this issue of restriction of range. So often studies, even if they're really accurate studies, they might only look at a small subsample, a small amount of changes. And so one example is the book Grit by Angela Duckworth, which is accompanied by a great TED Talk, which I've listened to. I previously taught the ideas to my students, which is the idea that grit, which she defines as passion and perseverance, is more predictive of success than other things such as IQ for an intellectual task or fitness for a physical task. And she takes the example of cadets who get into West Point, and then before actually graduating, you need to defeat this Beast Barracks 6 weeks challenge. And what she finds is that a bigger predictor of whether you complete Beast Barracks than your physical fitness is your grit. So on the face of it, it seems surprising, right? The army is a really physically demanding thing. And so if something is even more powerful than physical prowess, then that is quite surprising. But the issue was restriction of range. So that was the fact that she had taken people who are already very fit, because in order to get into West Point, your fitness levels will be really high. And there's diminishing returns to fitness. And so if you're already really fit, then it makes sense that something else like grit will do better than something such as fitness. But for the average man or woman on the street who dreams of joining the military, it might be that fitness is more important than grit. And so how does this address something like black and white thinking?
So just to kind of clarify the example, the example, her research does show that grit is more important, and it is incredibly interesting and validating for grit, but it doesn't mean that for the average Joe, grit is going to be more important in their ability to finish that, because there's like a necessary condition. It was tested only on people who bypassed something, and when we do research, we don't always even know all of those necessary conditions, especially when we do it in what's called a field study on real people who kind of, when we do it on a random sample of people, then everybody participates. But when we do it on a population that was selected, we don't even always know why were they picked people selected and what were the people who chose not to participate. So it's about taking the results of a certain study and concluding more generally. But if we think about what I think is your bigger point is not about just reading academic papers and reading the newspaper more thoughtfully, but it's about how we generalize from our own lives. I think it also means something very important about that. It means that in different circumstances, we might be in different ranges. So I might The things that might work for me at the workplace might not be the things that work for me at home, just because we're in a different part of the skill range and so on. So the conclusion, if you say that the big point is that conclusion changes depend on the selection bias or starting skill and so on, it also maybe mean that we're not the same people in all areas of life. And the things that help us in where we're weak or not that good might be different than the places we're experts, might be different in one environment versus another.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And this is why social science is so tricky. So if you think about the physical sciences, two carbon-14 atoms are the same. You can just change one condition and keep everything else constant. But people are different. And just because I react in a particular way doesn't mean that you react in the same way. And so this means that we need to be even more discerning with the findings of research, because even if a study is 100% watertight, so let's say Angela Duckworth did a study, there's nothing wrong with the study. It was robust, very careful as it was, but we cannot over extrapolate from what makes people who've already gotten to West Point successful to the general person on the street. And so this is why my book is called May Contain Lies. So people might think, well, the word lies, that seems pretty inflammatory. To call somebody a liar is a big step. But what I'm highlighting is that these lies can be subtle. So it doesn't mean that the person is being nefarious or deliberately trying to deceive. But lie is simply the opposite of truth, and something can be not truthful if there is a misleading interpretation. So as we discussed earlier, I don't think Simon Sinek set out to try to deceive anybody. He's just somebody who believes in why being important, and so he only gathered the evidence that supported his viewpoint. And similarly, for the idea that grit works, even if you're showing this very carefully within a particular setting, it doesn't necessarily apply to other settings. And also, if you were to find some research which is on people in the US, that might not apply to people outside the world, in other countries, which might have different cultural norms.
Yeah, and it also strengthened the point about you want to see things across multiple studies. So in the question of grit, there's lots of different studies, and you want to get your view across all of them. So in summary, I'll tell you kind of one of my thoughts, and tell me if that is helpful or not. I think that one of our metaphors for how we function is like a computer. It's often the case that whatever the tools we have become also our theories. And I think it's a helpful metaphor in some way. It tells us about processing speed and memory and a few other interesting elements of how we function: short-term memory, long-term memory, storage, forgetting, processing files. But it's also not very helpful because it's overly simplistic. Computer works in the same way when it's sunny and when it's rainy, and it works the same way at work and at home and so on. And we need to basically develop a more nuanced version. We need to develop a more nuanced version of ourselves. We need to develop a more nuanced version of data, of what is going on. And I think your book is basically about being cautious. About being cautious in interpreting things that we're learning from ourselves, about our own algorithms for learning. It's about being cautious about how other people use algorithms for learning, and hopefully kind of eliminate some of the bad elements of learning, and staying with what's actually more accurate. And it's a long process, but I think it can be enjoyable, especially done right.
And so do I. And I think what's enjoyable about it is just understanding these nuances. These are things which make sense, make common sense, and they are quite intuitive, that people might have different cultures, they might respond in different ways. And so if we think about the idea of black and white thinking, if we get to dispense with this and see the world in its full color, then that's a much richer and more beautiful world than just applying the same mental model to every single setting. So while it might initially seem, it might be hard work to try to have to adapt to each situation, I think that's what makes life interesting and fun.
Yeah, and maybe in closing, I would say that it was a fun read. It took me a while to get the book, but when I finally got it, I really enjoyed reading it. A lot of wonderful examples, and a lot of examples that I have to say that got me to rethink about things I haven't doubted before for all the
Mm.
reason that you say, and it's a humbling but pleasure read. So thank you very much for the book and the effort. And we didn't talk today about your research, which I'm a big fan of. But so thank you for everything you do, and hopefully people would enjoy the book.
Well, thank you so much. It's hugely flattering to hear this coming from you, Dan, an expert in these behavioral issues. So thank you so much. That those compliments mean a lot.
Very good. So stay in touch, and we'll talk soon.
Sounds great. Thanks so much. Take care.